My wife is a genius. There are many examples I could give you as to why I say that, but I want to share this one that's most relevant for this sermon. About a week and a half ago, we were in the car, and I was thinking about my sermon series on the 10 Commandments, and because of the trip I took last month, my schedule got thrown off kilter because I was planning on having this series done by now. And I was saying, boy, this 10th commandment, that Christmas coming up too, in addition to Thanksgiving, I'm going to have to put this sermon in January, and the 10th commandment's going to be out there just kind of dangling all by itself away from the other 9 commandments, and I hated to put it off for another 2 months. And she said, well, wait a minute. The 10th commandment is, thou shalt not covet. That would make an excellent Thanksgiving subject. And I thought, yeah, she's right. And she said, what are you, stupid or something? No, she didn't say that. She did not say that. But I thought, yeah, she's exactly right, because covetousness has to do with our attitude toward the blessings of God. It has to do with contentment, which has to do with thanksgiving. When we're a contented people, we're a grateful people, and it guards us against covetousness. And so this is the sermon on the 10th commandment, which will complete our series. And we're going to look at 2 verses today, one in Exodus chapter 20, which lists that 10th commandment, and then we'll move over to Hebrews chapter 13. But in Exodus 20, after God had given the first 9 commandments, he says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox. Got to watch that, coveting against an ox. Or his donkey, or anything. Notice how he just sums it all up. Instead of just listing continually, he says, nor anything that is your neighbor's. And then there's a related verse over in Hebrews 13 and verse 5 that says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Thou shalt not covet has been called the Forgotten Commandment, because it comes last in the list. Some people have seemed to think that it is of lesser importance than the other 9. And so some people kind of look at this one kind of as an add-on, especially when seen against the big ticket items like murder and adultery and stealing and lying. But the reality is, this commandment truly is foundational to the other 9. You say, why is that? Because this one commandment in particular really gets to the attitude of the heart rather than just our outward actions. And so this commandment kind of provides a safeguard against the temptation of breaking the other 9. And so this commandment, God really nails us where it counts. Right in the heart. And it reminds us that God is as interested in what our hearts are gawking at as he is with what our hands might be grabbing for. And the reality of it is that we break this commandment probably before we even break any of the other 9. I mean, think about it. If somebody murders someone, that person is already hated in his heart. If a person commits adultery, well, that person has already lusted for something that wasn't his or hers in the heart. If somebody steals, they've already coveted something that did not belong to them in the heart. That's already taken place. And so we probably break this commandment before we break any of the other 9 because it has its root right here in the heart. Years ago in the church, they used to talk about being saved and sanctified. Some of y'all people heard that expression, be saved and sanctified. Are you saved and sanctified? Well, I think we also need to be satisfied in our Lord. We need to be saved, sanctified, and satisfied. Right? Saved, sanctified, and satisfied. Satisfied in the sense that we're content with the blessings of God, that we're not coveting or longing for things that don't belong to us, but that we rest in him, that we're content in the Lord, and that we're saved, sanctified, and satisfied. Now today I want us to look at this 5th verse of Hebrews 13, and I want to take it apart just a little bit in 3 sections. And look at what God is saying to us about covetousness and contentment. All right, the first thing I want you to notice is that we need to empty our hearts of covetousness. We need to empty our hearts of covetousness. In verse 5 of Hebrews 13, the writer said, "Let your life be without covetousness." Now, I think it's very important for us to take a minute and really talk about what this means, because it could be misunderstood easily. I mean, does coveting mean that you just want something? You know, if you want a new car, or if you want a new outfit, a new pair of jeans, if you want a new pair of tennis shoes, is that coveting? Because you want something. And certainly that's not coveting. I mean, if wanting something in itself was coveting, then we would never buy anything. We would never get anything, because you generally want something, or at least need something, before you go out and purchase it, right? So just seeing something that I wouldn't mind having that, or I'd like that, or I need that, that certainly in and of itself is not coveting. Your neighbor may have a new boat, and you may think to yourself, boy, I sure would like to have a boat too. I could take my family out on the lake on a Saturday and do some water skiing, or maybe do some fishing or something. That'd be really nice. Nothing wrong with that, right? But when you start resenting your neighbor for having a boat, or when you get miserable because you don't have a boat, then you're getting into the area of coveting. You see, here's really where coveting hits, is when we get fixated on something, or I think when we just aren't content, or just are dissatisfied with life because of something somebody else has. And it might not even be material. You can even be jealous of somebody's looks, or somebody's talent, or somebody's ability, or somebody's job. And you could just determine in your heart, maybe not a conscious decision, but it just happens to where you're not happy, or you're not content, or you're not satisfied because you don't have somebody else's charisma, or somebody else's friendship network, or as many friends as somebody else has on Facebook. You know, and you're just miserable. And you say, I'm not going to be happy until I get this particular job, or until I have this much money, or until I have this kind of a fashion wardrobe like my friend has, or it could be any number of things. When we become fixated on something, or become to a point where we're just going to be miserable or unhappy because we don't have what somebody else has, that is displeasing to the Lord. That's why the writer of Hebrews said we need to let our lives be without covetousness, because it can destroy us. I mean, have you ever seen somebody that's just not happy because it seems like life is just never good enough? And they always find somebody who has more than they have, or they have a better job than they have, or a better spouse than they have, or more obedient kids than they have, or they live in a nicer neighborhood. It could be any number of things. And they're just like always grumbling, always. Isn't that a miserable way to live? Maybe that's you. Wouldn't you rather just be content? Boy, it's a lot less stressful. A lot less stressful. I'd rather be happy than dwarf than grumpy. Wouldn't you? There's a quote I want to share with you, and I don't generally ask you to write things down, but this did not originate with me, so I can say, if you want to write this down, this is one of the best quotes that I've ever come across when it comes to contentment. I mean, this is one of those put on your refrigerator kind of things, in my opinion. All right, here it is. Very simple. I'll repeat it. Don't let what you have not poison what you have. Don't let what you have not poison what you have. I love that quote, because it's easy to look around at all the things we don't have. And don't let the things that you don't have destroy what you have. Maybe there's a talent that you wish you had, an ability that you wish you had, and you just don't have it. It's just not in you. Well, don't let that destroy the talent that you do have, the ability that you do possess. There are just all kinds of things that we can just look around and say, well, I wish I had that, or I wouldn't mind living in that house, or I'd love to have that kind of car, or that amount of money, or whatever it might be. And we can just live our lives just longing for all these things that we don't have. And in the meantime, we're not appreciating the things that we do have. So don't let what you have not poison what you have, because God's given you some good blessings. And your longing for all these things that you don't have are poisoning the things that you do have. And sometimes you just need to let it go and say, you know what? I'm going to look at what God's blessed me with. My bedroom may not be big enough, but at least I have a comfortable bed to sleep on. My kitchen may not be just the way I want it. It may not have that nice island in the middle and the nice room that my neighbor has. But you know what? It's functional. I may not have all the money in the world, but boy, God's blessed me with good family and friends. And what's more important anyway? I think sometimes what we need to do is just take a step back and look at our lives. Because a lot of times we look at other people's lives and we see how glamorous we think they have it. We think of how together they are and how perfect their life seems to be. And it might seem that way from your vantage point. But you know what? You might have it pretty good yourself. But maybe you've just gotten so accustomed to it or so bored with it that you don't realize the blessing that is yours. When our kids were little, I have to admit we were watching the Disney Channel one day. And they had a short. You know what? They didn't use the word short when I was growing up in this context. But they have a short. What a short is, like a 2 or 3 minute piece, maybe between shows, that has a story. And usually a really good message. And this one that we watched was animated. And it meant so much to me that I recorded it one day, and I actually went back and I wrote out the entire narrative, the entire story. And I really liked this. And I don't have the actual video of it, couldn't find it, but here's the story, here's the entire narrative. So picture this in your mind. It was all animated, really good. A little girl named Sue lived in a big brown building in the city. From her window, she could see a faraway building that during the day looked like any other. But every night, Sue waited for the sunset when the building's windows turned to golden diamonds. And Sue wished that she lived in a building as wonderful as that. Well, one day she set off down the street to see the windows up close. But when she got there, she saw that the windows were made of ordinary glass. Just then, another little girl came out of the building. And Sue asked if she knew where the wonderful building with windows of golden diamonds had gone. The little girl smiled, for she knew the building well. She turned Sue around just as the sun was setting and pointed to a building far away with shimmering, glimmering windows. When Sue saw it, she gasped, for the building she was looking at was hers. And so as night fell, Sue happily hurried home to her own beautiful building with windows of golden diamonds and the lucky family that lived there. And so in the end, Sue realized that both buildings were pretty. It was just in how you looked at them. And you know, sometimes we look at somebody's life and we think, man, they've got it made. They just got such a nice life. They've got just the perfect family. And they got good jobs and nice neighborhood. And, you know, you don't know it, but if you were to just take a step back and look at your life, you may have it better than what you thought. I'm not talking about materially necessarily. But a lot of the blessings that you've maybe just taken for granted for years. Can you imagine if they were pulled away from you all of a sudden? You know, people might be looking at your building thinking it shines pretty bright. And realize God's blessed you. So we need to empty our hearts of covetousness. The writer of Hebrews said, let your life be without covetousness. And then we need, secondly, to fill our hearts with contentment. He said, be content with such things as you have. To be content with such things as you have. There was an author named G.K. Chesterton who said that there are 2 ways to get enough. He said one is to accumulate more and more, and the other is to desire less. Now I want to say that again because I want to just have a friendly debate with this man who's no longer with us. But because I have a little issue with one of the statements in that, but I think it's a good quote. He said there are 2 ways to get enough. One is to accumulate more and more. That's the part I want to quibble with a little bit because I have observed in life that these people who feel like they need to accumulate more and more to be happy never reach that level of happiness. It's like they get consumed, obsessed with always wanting more, and it's like no amount is enough. And so they just want more and more and more, and so they never get enough. And I remember when Ricky Henderson was in his prime, And he was like, I can't remember, it was like the 25th or 30th highest paid baseball player at the time. And he was making millions of dollars a year. Millions. And he was griping. He's like, I don't want to be the 30th best paid player in baseball. In other words, I'm better than that. I deserve more than that. Now here was a man, any of us would have loved to have had his salary. My goodness, he was making millions every year to play a game that he loved. And he was griping because he wasn't at the top of the food chain. You see, it's like when people can get so-called enough, but they never have enough. And so I don't think the best way to get enough is by accumulating more and more. It's like you're never satisfied. So I think the second part of G.K. Chesterton's statement is the key part. The real way to get enough is to desire less. Now, I don't mean that you need to put yourself on some pauper's lifestyle. I'm not saying you need to just get rid of all your stuff. I'm just saying be content with what you have. So you don't have an 84-inch television. Do you really, is it really going to make your life that much better? And when your car breaks down on the highway, are you going to say, well, at least I have an 84-inch television set? You know? Or when you get in an argument with your spouse, are you going to say, well, at least my TV's good? Or your kids get rebellious, is that television really going to impact your life that much? You know, we obsess with these things. It's like, is it really that important? One of the things I shared with you last month about my trip to the Philippines was, first of all, the living conditions of people there, and of course in many other parts of the world. It's unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life. I don't know if those same conditions exist here in America. It's hard for us to identify. And I know that if any of us were put in their homes, within a couple of days we'd be wanting out of there. We'd be saying, okay, I want my nice recliner, I want my nice kitchen, I want my microwave oven, all this kind of stuff, you know. We would not want to live there for very long at all. But what amazed me about it, and I shared this with you, but I want to remind you because it's so pertinent to this particular message, is that the people there are generally content. I mean, it's remarkable how they have so little and live in such, in many cases, filthy, almost unbearable conditions. I mean, I saw two boys taking baths in a bucket outside. I saw two naked children on the streets of Manila. One of them even going to the bathroom. And this is life for them. And yet, you walk by these people and you talk to people and they're so happy with so little. Contrast that with a missionary that came to America one time, and after observing our country for a while, his comment was that Americans, generally speaking, are rich, especially compared to other countries, are rich and well-fed, and yet so unhappy. I mean, what an indictment that is on us. Well, you think about some countries where they have so little, and yet they're generally happy, contented, joy-filled people. And then we have us in America, who, boy, they look at us and, man, we are filthy rich. Even if you're just even lower class in income, they would say, wow. They would love to have that kind of income, you know? And yet, we in America, we just gripe and complain. We're just so unhappy. You know, a lot of it's just so relative. I think a lot of it is we look at people who have more, and so we think we're poor. You know, it's the whole keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing. You know, we look at somebody, boy, they have this, so I gotta have it, you know? And so it's all relative. We look at our lives in terms of other people instead of just realizing God has blessed us as He has. One of my favorite stories is about this one guy over in Budapest. And he goes to his rabbi, and he says to him, he says, life is unbearable. He says, there are 9 of us living in one room. And he said, we just can't stand it. He said, can you help us? What can we do? And the rabbi talks to him for a while, and he says, here's what I want you to do. He said, I want you to go back home, and he said, I want you to put your goat in the room with you. And the guy's just beside himself. He's like, my goat, are you serious? It's already crowded enough. But the rabbi says, just do as I say. Put the goat in the room with you. Come back next week and see me. So the guy does as he says. And the following week, he comes back to the rabbi, and he's just distraught. I mean, he's more of a wreck than he was the week before. And he says, Rabbi, you've got to do something. This goat is just destroying our lives. I mean, he's smelly, he's filthy. He grabs at anything he can get his mouth on. He's just destroying everything. And the rabbi says, okay, I hear you. I want you to go home now. I want you to take that goat out. I want you to come back next week and see me. And so he goes back home. He takes the goat out. A week later, he comes back to see the rabbi, and he's just smiling. Man, he's carefree. And he says to the rabbi, he says, life is so wonderful. He said, all of us living together with no goat. Just the 9 of us. Just the 9 of us. Before, the 9 of them was just too much. But now it's just the 9 of them. Isn't it wonderful? You know, so much of it's relative. You know, it's all how we look at things. You know, if we could really see things in perspective and just looked at how God has given us the blessings he has, we'd be so grateful. We'd be so grateful. Well, once again, in Hebrews 13:5, we need to empty our hearts of covetousness, fill our hearts with contentment. And number 3, we need to rest our hearts in Jesus. We need to rest our hearts. He said in verse 5, he said, let your life be without covetousness, be content with such things as you have, for the Lord has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. It's as though the writer of Hebrews is saying, God is the source of our contentment. God is what we need. And that's where we need to put our joy. And that's whom we need to rely on. Not on stuff, not on things, not on possessions, not on things that aren't his will for us necessarily, but to rest in Jesus, even if we had nothing else. To know that Jesus is there and that salvation is there and that heaven is waiting for us and the presence of God is with us every day. That's where our contentment needs to lie. When I was in school, I have to admit, Shakespeare drove me crazy. Even though he's my namesake of William, he and I just did not get along very well. Some people just have a gift for interpreting this, but he had a quote that I want to share with you. And I want to kind of spend a little bit of time here because I think this really says a lot to our modern day. There's a quote from Shakespeare that says, striving to better, oft we mar what's well. Okay, he said, striving to better, oft we mar what's well. It's similar to the expression we have, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. What we have is often a good thing, but we kind of give it up in our search for those 2 that are in the bush. You know, striving to make our lives better, we often destroy what was good to begin with. You know, look, you have it good here, things are going well, but you think, well, I want something better, I want something more, so we strive for something better. And in the process, a lot of times we destroy the good that was in our lives before. Let me give you an example so we can relate to this better. Let's suppose there is a family, your all-American family, 2.5 kids, whatever, 2-3 kids, and husband and wife that's happy. They go to church. Their God is a very important part of their lives. Maybe a middle-class family. Maybe the dad works, certainly. Maybe the mom works. That they all do well getting along. They have a very obedient, compliant children and generally happy family. But let's just suppose that the husband and the wife are talking and they get a little restless. And they want more out of life. They just feel like, you know, we could provide so many more opportunities for our kids, if we had more money or if we had better things. And so the husband takes a second job, maybe a third job, and maybe his wife starts working or takes a second job if she already has one. And they start working all these crazy hours, and they make more money, but in the process, things start to dwindle in their home. The husband and wife don't see each other as often as they once did. They get a little irritable with each other. They don't communicate like they once did. They're stressed. They're tired. Because they're so busy, they don't go to church as much as they once did. The children begin to get rebellious. They don't see their parents often as they did before, and the children and the parents both start to fall away from the Lord and their commitment there. And just the financial, even though they're making more money, they get into greater debt because they're buying more stuff because they feel like they need this to really provide for their kids the good life, you know, and things just begin to fall apart. Now, if you think I'm just making up some story off the cuff, that it really doesn't happen in America that way, let me tell you this little tidbit that's related but different. This is a true story. The first time we were in Ohio, back in the early 90s when I was an associate pastor, there was a woman in the church named Sandy who was an insurance worker, and she would go to homes sometimes to do assessments. And Cindy was very good friends with Sandy, and a couple of times, or maybe more, Cindy would go with her. And Cindy was telling me about one particular time they went to this house. It was in a very beautiful, large house in an upscale neighborhood to assess this home. And they walked in, there was no one else there, and I don't think there was anyone there, but Cindy was kind of taken aback by the fact that the house was practically barren. I mean, it was practically empty inside, even though there was a family living there. Furnishings were hardly there at all. And Cindy said something about this to Sandy. And Sandy said, oh, this is pretty common. This isn't unusual at all. She said, what happens is the couples want the best. And so they'll do whatever they can to buy this huge house and get the huge mortgage. It's such a burden to them. And then they can't afford furniture. And they've extended their credit to the max. And she said also that a lot of times in situations like this, the couples get divorced just because of the stress and the burden of it all. Now you see, that goes back to that Shakespeare quote. Striving to better, oft we mar what's well. In an effort to make our lives so-called better, by getting more stuff and having a higher standard of living and this and that, a lot of times we destroy the good that was right in our hands the whole time. And if we would just look at our lives and say, you know, we've got it pretty good. And I want you to understand, I'm not saying it's wrong if you take a second job. I'm not saying it's wrong to work overtime. I'm not saying it's wrong to provide greater opportunities for your family. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that as you do those things, or as you consider them, use wisdom. Okay, use wisdom. Pray about it. Talk to your spouse about it. How is this going to affect our relationship with our kids? Is this going to stretch us too thin? Emotionally? What impact is it going to have on our marriage? Are we still going to be able to see each other and communicate? That's so vital to a strong marriage. What's it going to do to our credit and all this kind of stuff? I mean, it's very, very important stuff that affects your family. And so consider these things. Because, you know, there's a lot of stuff in life more important than stuff. And so don't destroy your family in an effort to keep up with the Joneses. The Joneses don't care about you anyway. They really don't. And so our rest needs to be in the Lord. That needs to be our most important source of contentment. If Jesus is our source of contentment, then all this other stuff will just be fringe stuff, okay? Because Jesus is where our rest is. In the Caribbean, there is a country called Trinidad and Tobago. It's actually made up of those two islands. Tobago is the smaller of the two, I believe. And there was a missionary down there at Tobago one time, and he was ministering in a leper colony. Now, I don't know how much you know about leprosy, but leprosy attacks the nerves of the body, and parts of the body will literally fall off. Ears will fall off. Fingers will literally fall off a person's body, toes, and things of that nature. And this man was ministering in a leper colony in Tobago. And he was leading a worship service at one point, and he asked the people there if they would like to sing a particular song. And when he asked the question, a woman turned and faced him, and the man said later it was the most disfigured face that he had ever seen in his life. The woman's ears had fallen off. She had no nose. Her lips were even gone. And she raised a hand that had no fingers on it because leprosy had attacked her so terribly. And she said to the song leader, the missionary, she said, could we sing, get this, count your blessings. Count your blessings. Name them one by one. And it will surprise you what the Lord has done. And this worship pastor said he started leading the song. He said he couldn't finish it. The people continued to sing because they knew the song, but he said, I couldn't finish it. He was just so touched that here was a woman whose body was falling apart, was so stricken with leprosy. And yet the song that came to her heart was, count your blessings. And shame on us for ever even thinking, what do I have to be thankful for? Because I've always maintained that even if things are at its worst for the Christian, we can always thank God for Jesus. We can always thank God for salvation. Even if everything else fell apart. And even if our own lives were hanging by a thread, we can always say, thank you, Jesus, that you love me, that you saved me, that I have the hope of heaven, because those are things that nothing in this world can destroy. Somebody said one time that discontentment makes rich men poor, while contentment makes poor men rich. So do you know that you can be rich if you want to, even if you don't have much of this world's good? See, you can have all the money in the world, but if you're unhappy and if you're not content, you're really a very poor person. Or you could barely be scraping to get by. But if you're content in what God has blessed you with, you are very rich. And I'd rather be rich in the Lord and be content in Him than have all the money in the world and be miserable. So let's strive to be rich in here and be content in what God has given to us, for he has blessed us beyond measure. Will you stand with me as we pray? Our dear Lord in heaven,